Okay, so let's try this with questions coming from the folks on the floor. I think Julia and Gabriel, who helped get the maps out, are here. Maybe you could help move the mic around the room if we need it. Can we pull one of these mics off? So why don't you just raise your hand if you have a question, and let's take 3 questions, and then we'll take some responses from the panel. Got one? And tell us your name and your question.
Hi, I'm John Russo. I'm former director of the Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State and coordinator of their labor studies program. I think Lee started to talk about this a little bit toward the end, but my own view is that there's been too much emphasis on Wisconsin, okay? And as opposed to what happened in Ohio, where I remember this meeting with all the press in the state of Ohio, with the research director for AFSCME, Amy Hanauer from Ohio Policy Matters, and myself. And there was great research information that they gave out. But when the reporters asked me, is this a good thing, with this fight for SB 5, against SB 5, and not come out, I said, yeah, I think it's great. And I said it was great because it gives the labor movement and public sector workers a way of talking to their communities about what they do. You know, I was an OEA member, and there are 140,000 OEA members. There's about 30,000 AFT members. Lee, how many AFT members in Ohio?
100,000.
100,000. You can go to firefighters and police. And it gave those folks a chance to start talking to their own communities. And the result of that, and you have to, I can speak directly more to the teachers, when you see a large number of Republican, suburban women who are teaching in Ohio out canvassing, there's something going on. And the question, after we had that incredible defeat of SB 5, where 62 or 63% of the state voted against it, people asked me, what do you think the next issue is? I said, will the labor movement demobilize what they had just mobilized? And I think we can see that in 2014.
Okay. Let's get a couple other questions, and then we'll get some responses. I see one here.
Thank you. Barry Castlins with the firefighters. Joe McMartin mentioned something when he was telling the Baltimore story, and he just kind of touched on something that I think is very significant, is that strike, that sanitation strike, was a wildcat strike. And what we have seen over and over again in places, certainly I know in the public safety arena, the strikes were wildcat strikes, and the result was a collective bargaining process. I think we don't do a good enough job, or how can we do a better job, of making it clear that collective bargaining is not about raising conflicts, it's about avoiding conflicts and resolving conflicts. The conflicts between labor and management are going to happen whether or not you've got collective bargaining right. Collective bargaining is the solution to the conflicts, not the cause.
Okay. One more. There's a sister here on the aisle.
I was part of the Maryland Juvenile Justice Reform Coalition in the 1990s, and to its credit, the coalition met in the impoverished parts of Baltimore. We circulated to involve the community, to promote the Massachusetts program, Books Not Jails. My concern is that globalization as a philosophy, so to speak, is treated in most media as irreversible and good. And no one talks about the effects on these other economies when we ship our products and undermine their economy. And it's like the best of all worlds for Monsanto and other corporations. So I guess my question to AFSCME and the labor union movement in general is, why aren't they challenging globalization as a detriment to our economy and to our jobs, and to use it to protect the economy and bring back the jobs and lift up the rest of the world that way? they can certainly feed themselves. They don't need Monsanto to feed them. And that is not part of the discussion.
Okay, 3 pretty different questions. Does one of you want to take the first
Well,
stab?
let me just deal with the whole notion of a globalized economy. And if you haven't noticed, there's a big fight that's going on right now regarding the trade bill that the president is proposing. There's a big fight going on whether he should have fast track authority. There's a big fight whether we should be supportive of TPP. The entire labor movement within the AFL-CIO and outside of the AFL-CIO is opposed to fast track and opposed to TPP because we have seen this picture before. We've sat in this movie before where it results in a loss of jobs all across this country, but especially in urban areas. It results in wages being reduced in this country, and it provides an unfair advantage, we believe, to the countries that are participating in these pacts. We support fair trade, but we don't support the fast track where no one has the ability to make changes within that legislation, within that what is negotiated. And it can't happen under a cloak of secrecy. And that's what's happening right now. Now, let me be clear on this. We have been very, very supportive of the president on many, many major issues. On this issue, we respectfully disagree with him because we believe that it harms workers in this country. It benefits other countries at the expense of our workers, not only union members, but working families, and we are 100% opposed to this effort. And we're going to continue to fight. And we're going to continue to say, have fair trade, but what you've got to be concerned about is to create jobs in this country with livable wages so people can survive. Do you want to comment on that?
I'll take one of the other 3. SB 5 in Ohio, was certainly a marked contrast, an important contrast to Wisconsin. But I think what's important to understand about what's going on right now are at least 3 things. One is that the map of where the fights are taking place has expanded. You take this, and it used to be we had a pretty stable border of right-to-work states and states that didn't have public sector collective bargaining. But the terrain where we're threatened is expanded exponentially. So you have, with right-to-work, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin like a dagger into the industrial Midwest. You have, likewise, Wisconsin with public sector bargaining. So where these battles are being fought has expanded in an era of more limited resources, one. Secondly, it used to be that our opponents were largely waging a legal and an air war. And now they're also waging a ground war. So it used to be they'd come right to work and file an action challenging one aspect or another of the law. Now they actually have people on the ground and organizations which they're forming to try to organize in the way that we have traditionally organized. And then thirdly, as Lee described, there's an extraordinarily admirable effort on AFSCME's part, and particularly in other unions, to organize internally and to remobilize the membership and reconnect with the membership and refashion our organizations along sensible lines. That's great, but in an era of limited resources, if you're focused internally, you can't be as focused externally. So, it's just important to recognize that Ohio was important, but it represents the expanded nature of the battle that's going on here in an era of limited resources. So it's a very difficult and precarious position that we have to realize we're in and figure out how to get out of.
Mm-hmm. Joe?
Well, I'm glad that the point was made about collective bargaining not as the problem but the solution, as it was really in Baltimore in the summer of 1974. That was a wildcat strike. And the union came in and was able to bring about a settlement. And that's important to remember. That gives me an opportunity maybe to make a point that I didn't have time enough to make before, and to connect to something Lee just said. Now, why did that lie about let Baltimore burn take hold? I think part of it was that it was a bipartisan lie from the beginning. But I think it was also taking hold because of the moment in time economically in this country in which that lie first took shape, right? 1974 was the beginning of the era of globalization as Americans were experiencing it, right? And Baltimore was right at the epicenter, in a sense, because as the container ships pulled into Baltimore in the early 1970s, the jobs were going out. And Pedro Negura kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier. The lack of jobs there, I think, is partly what we've seen this last week, or more evidence of. This moment in 1974 was filled with such possibility, it seems to me. Within the same union, AFSCME then, were the police and the sanitation workers, right? One mostly black group, one overwhelmingly white group. Recently, we've seen the police as a sort of occupying force in Baltimore. What happened over the last 40 years that produced that? In part, the success of the lie that occurred and the implications of that lie have created the chasm that now, many of our cities are witness to. The model of development that mayor at that time, William Donald Schaefer, had for Baltimore was to develop the Inner Harbor, right? Which we saw happen, to build that beautiful stadium, et cetera, and all that came to be. But that model of development didn't produce jobs for a lot of people, right? The way that city was run has helped to produce what we currently have. And part of what happened over time with the kinds of decisions that were made, a lot of times by Democrats, was that a model of development came into being in our cities and in our country that was not for the common good, quite frankly, that benefited some and really produced not much at all for others. TPP, I think, is a perfect model of how that might again yet happen, right? So it's important for us to remember it wasn't always that way. It didn't have to be that way. That there were conscious decisions made at a point in time that helped direct us on the path that has led us to where we are now. And knowing that, I think, is important because decisions were made that produce these outcomes. Decisions can be made publicly and commonly to change them.